1 minute past the hour and we will kick off. Thanks everyone for joining us today for our regular monthly webinar. Last year it was the growing geoeconomic risks which show no sign of abating. Today we're going to look at quite literally crisis management and indeed crisis communication from the front line. And I am really pleased today to be joined by Richard Gaisford, with whom we've worked out. I've worked with for almost 30 years now, which is somewhat scary, but
you feel up.
It's been fun though, hasn't it, Richard?
It certainly has. It most certainly has. Thank you for having me along.
Absolutely. So Richard, as you will hear and many of you will know, is former Chief Correspondent of GMTV. Did that role for over 20 years, 25, 26 years, was it, Richard?
26 years. Very sadly, it came to an end at the end of the year. So, yeah, almost, well, more than a quarter of a century, almost 26 years.
Excellent. And, you know, Richard is therefore an extremely experienced, credible reporter and broadcaster, and often he has been reporting from the front line. We're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail during the webinar, but Richard is one of these people that wants to be there, wants to be in the heart of the action, and whereas some people are running away from any sign of risk or danger, it seems that Richard is attracted to those environments, and we'll talk about maybe why. But on a serious note, journalists are literally on the front line in many crises, and I'm not sure if the people on this call are aware, but this is the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire in the UK, and it commemorates all those who have in the armed forces who have fallen in combat. What they are doing now, which I think is an amazing and brilliant idea, is to create a memorial for those journalists who have been killed in the line of duty, literally on the front line. So I think that's a really nice twist, and I think it's really appropriate that those people who put their own lives at risk to tell us what's really going on out there, to have that memorial, which they hope to have established within the next couple of years, I think is absolutely fantastic. And as I mentioned, Richard himself has very much been on that front line. And I guess, Richard, maybe if you just tell us a little bit more about your career, but then particularly talk to us about some of the places from which you have reported, and maybe help us to answer that kind of conundrum that I mentioned, that many people would hate to be on the front line of a conflict. What is it that draws you to those places?
Okay, well, I'm a storyteller, and that is why, because these are the big stories, and these are the ones that I think, you know, have most impact, most effect on people's lives. And so getting out to these places is really important for me, to be able to tell them back home what's been going on. And so for more than a quarter of a century, my job was to make sure that people making up in the UK got a really good view of what was happening in the world. And that was what made our program quite special, was that we invested in that type of storytelling, allowing us to get out around the world, being there, not just on the front line, but any situation where things were really happening, you know, explaining live quite often what was going on. You see there, I'm stood in the middle of the aftermath of the Boxing Day tsunami still. There's a couple of stills there from Nepal after that most unbelievable earthquake. And that bottom right picture, as I look at it, is actually on the front line with the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces fighting ISIS, as they were making their way from Mosul towards further into northern Iraq. And this is just a small handful of stories that I've been telling over a period of time. And as you showed that still, memorial site, the National Memorial, really quite something, that place. I've been reporting there on remembrance duties for decades now. Ever since it first came about, it's really evolved. as a place. And I will know some on that memorial, and I know that just in my mind as you mentioned it, Simon Cumbers, was a former colleague who was with Frank Gardner when they were both in Saudi Arabia. As you'll know, Frank Gardner still was in a wheelchair, still in a wheelchair, and bears huge scars of that attack, Simon sadly dying. And also a gentleman called Lloyd, who was a legendary IT correspondent, who was just a mile or so ahead during the 2003 invasion, and when that city of Basra was taken. Terry was operating as a unilateral correspondent. Again, just a mile or so ahead of us when he was mistaken by American forces as an Iraqi insurgent, and he was shot and killed along with his crew. So yeah, very much there is a risk to the work, but there is a huge importance to it, and personally, again, from doing it, it's not about an excitement and adrenaline rush. It's about being able to tell these most important stories. And so you're right, we spend a lot of our time trying to get into those places that a lot of other people are trying to get out of.
And apologies to those on the call. I think me being unmuted caused a bit of an echo when Richard was speaking, so I will go on mute when the important person on this call is talking. But so Richard, what has your experience on these front lines? What has it taught you about crisis management? What has it taught you about uncertainty, and what has it taught you about people? You've said these are stories, these are about people. What has it taught you about people, but also what has it taught you about crisis?
So my storytelling is almost always focused on people, because that is the best way of illustrating the issue and showing people what's going on. And, I think the one thing that I learned from a crisis is that it always gets worse before it gets better. That initial shock is, the thing that stimulates the interest, get you jumping on a plane, rushing around the world to be there. But and you look at those pictures of the tsunami or the earthquakes there, that initial death toll is always such a low estimate of how bad things are going to be. And it doesn't just have to be death, it could be an ecological disaster, it could be a financial disaster that's going on. Generally, when you start peeling away the layers, you get yourself on the ground, you realize that actually things are much worse than people have said. Very rarely have I ever turned up somewhere for something bad that was happening or about to happen, and for it not to be worse than we thought. One example where things were, we had a massive flood working its way across towards Brisbane down in Australia. They put me on a plane and I flew down there. I got into a helicopter the moment I got off the plane. We flew up to see this massive wall of water kind of working its way, and it looked bad. And then nothing really happened. It didn't quite hit. And, having flown for the best part of 36 hours to get there and been there and eventually just turned around, I think that's about the one instance where it just generally wasn't as bad. So in terms of that crisis, then seeing, the initial breaking news, I remember sitting at home here in this sitting room, watching that wall of water from the Japanese tsunami back in 2011. And thinking, this is bad. I mean, those initial CCTV pictures of those floodwaters coming in and working their way through cities in a way that we hadn't seen 6 years before for the Indian Ocean tsunami. Purely, I think, because the technology wasn't quite as good, but perhaps people weren't able to share video in quite the same way. And seeing that happening in Japan and knowing that we had to get on a plane, and that's exactly what we did. So, yes, things get bad. But also people are resilient. I mean, it is the most incredible thing to be have the privilege of seeing people in the very worst circumstances making the very most of what they have. And so often I will be focusing on these people who are desperately trying to live a normal life in the most abnormal situations, trying to be ordinary as extraordinary things are happening all around them. And then watching the response to that, the world response to that, and seeing these pictures from Nepal are actually really interesting to me. I haven't seen them for a while, but knowing that we were broadcasting this unfolding disaster as we pushed further out of Kathmandu. The top right picture there is Kathmandu and the buildings that were collapsed and the families that were homeless there, but then pushing out into the countryside, up into the hills, into the you know, the rice farms around Kathmandu and seeing just how bad things were. You can see the devastation around behind us there. And then getting messages from the boss of Save the Children. Keep going, you know, please keep broadcasting, because every time you do, our donations go up. So knowing that you are having an effect. And so for me, it's been really important actually to get that kind of feedback, and to know that, you know, whilst there's a personal interest for me in telling these stories, it does have an impact and effect. And then the Nepal one was quite interesting actually. I came back and I discovered that even in my own village, they were fundraising. And, you know, trying to create new schools, because so many schools have been knocked out. And so seeing the impact that those broadcasts had on a personal level with people that I knew as well.
A couple of observations on what you just said, Richard. Firstly, you talked about when you head off for a crisis, only on one occasion that you can think of has it actually been better than everyone expected. 9 times out of 10, it actually ends up being worse than everyone expected. And I guess that's just a lesson for all of us that work in crisis management on the other side of the fence, as it were, that sometimes particularly leaders want to imagine that this is all just going to blow over, and actually it'll all be fine, and very quickly it'll all be fine. Much better to plan for the worst case, because that's probably more realistic. But secondly, if you plan for the worst case and it doesn't happen, fine, but if it does, you'll be prepared for that. And I guess the second observation would be, again, for the people on this call, again, it's interesting to hear the parallels. I think many of the people on this call, and it's certainly true for me and my colleagues at Insignia, do what we do to help mitigate, avoid, prevent some of the harm that otherwise happens if a crisis is badly managed. And again, it's interesting that you too are seeking to have, in your own way, a positive impact on how the situation plays out, or how it is understood, or those affected by it. So yeah, there's real meaning to what I think everybody on this call does.
I think part of it is you do get to this situation where you want to explain to people what's happened, because actually it might then have a knock-on effect on them. And just recently I've come across a number of people, you know, quite sensible, serious grown-ups, who tell me they don't watch the news anymore because it upsets them, it distresses them, it causes them to be depressed. And I think that's really, to me, that's really sad, because yes, none of these things that you see in front of you are good, you know, thousands of people dying in a tsunami, or being crushed in an earthquake, or, you know, ongoing wars with, you know, people being forced from their homes. But all of these things have an impact on our world, and eventually on our life as well. And I think for me, it's so important to tell the stories, but more so for people to try and engage in some way at least, and to shut the door on it, and to, you know, say, from the point of view of not preparing for the worst, if it's your business, to put your head in the sand, that's really the worst possible thing you can do. You know, at that point, the glass has to be half empty, I think. You know, there's a place for optimism. And as you're staring into a crisis, that is not necessarily the best place to be. But it's important because, you know, a lot of these stories that I've done, not these the ones necessarily, perhaps the one with, you know, fighting ISIS on the front line there, that created a refugee crisis that we're still seeing the impact of today, and is shaping our politics and everything around us. So for me, people should be engaged with the news, and it's important that people like me do it. Of course, there's nothing you can do about natural disasters, and it's sometimes quite hard to plan for those. But from a business perspective, there is an awful lot you can do, and I think we might probably end up talking about some of those things later.
Absolutely. And again, another quick observation before we move on to the next slide. I think there is a tendency, or the potential, for particularly people in business to see the media in a crisis as part of the problem, something that needs to be handled or managed. I think, again, just hearing you talk about the positive impact that your coverage can have, there is the opportunity to, you know, work in partnership with the media, or if not even in partnership, to use the power of the media to help you achieve some of your, and I don't mean commercial business objectives, but if you need people to know something quickly, or you know, you need experts in X, Y, or Z, or funding for X, Y, or Z, then actually the media can be very much part of the solution, not necessarily the problem.
Yeah, most certainly there. And look, I mean, I was out in northern Thailand for those poor boys, the football team that got stuck in the caves. And it was the publicity about that crisis that eventually led to the solution. Now, there's a few solutions that didn't help along the way, Elon Musk getting involved and all of that, but it meant that it did attract the attention to get the experts to where they were needed to be, and eventually, thank goodness, it was a great result, as it was with the miners in Chile. You know, I was camped out there in the Atacama Desert, and a huge amount of expertise came in from around the world, largely because of the publicity that had been garnered by the story. So I can understand why people would be worried about having media involvement in their crisis. But firstly, I think it's something that you can't avoid. And so if you can't avoid it, let's see what you can do to maximize the positive impact of having those cameras, journalists and reporters there.
Okay, so moving on. Clearly, not all of the time. Sometimes you are in the studio, but a lot of your work has been, as we talked about, you know, in the front line. Often the front line is a hostile environment. Crisis in business brings pressure and risk. Your job brings pressure and risk. How do you make decisions in crisis? How do you manage risk in very hostile environments, Richard?
So the first thing is I say I want to go, and then a huge discussion happens about how that is going to be made possible, and that has changed. Definitely, the balance of these decisions has changed over the 25, 26 years that I've been doing that kind of work. You know, little thought was given to personal safety at the start, and you know, there was an interesting story of how I was sent into Beirut during a war effectively between Lebanon and Israel back in 2006, was mistaken as part of that for an Israeli spy, and was held captive and threatened. And my life, probably, I've never really been closer, I think, to losing my life. I have been in situations before, but that one, I was extremely close, and actually afterwards found out that 20 people who'd been accused of being Israeli spies had been taken away and hung the day before. So it was a very lucky outcome, not such a pleasant few hours spent in Beirut at that. But that really was a product of not enough thought being put into Ascend. It started a conversation in my organization and other organizations, and so many other instances have. We talked about Frank Gardner with Simon Cumbers being shot in Saudi Arabia. You know, every single time something bad happens, another lesson sadly is learned, but, you know, more protocols are put into place. So you look here at pictures of me more recently in Ukraine, and just to get there, we have to put a huge amount in place. And so at ITV, they had a risk team. They would be people who worked primarily, had been part of security services, had been in the army. They would be looking at the company's insurance policies, getting extra insurance. The gentleman in sunglasses on the right-hand side of that first picture is a trained paramedic, but also a trained security operator. Actually, Dave, I've worked with now for the best part of 4 years out in Ukraine, had been running the security for the Americans at the US Embassy in Kabul. So you can see the kind of pedigree of the person that you're involved with. And so before you leave, huge amount put in place. We then have to think about the body armor that we're taking, the kind of vehicle we're going to be using. Dave will be putting together risk assessments for every journey that we make. Those will be shared. We will be tracked wherever we are, because somewhere like Ukraine right now, it's somewhere that 4 years ago, I could have flown to, and I did. I flew in and out of Ukraine just before the invasion, 3 hours from London, give or take a few minutes. Now it's a much more difficult thing. It is a no-fly zone, and that means if you're stuck down in southeastern Ukraine, you're 14 hours from the border. You can't fly out if you have an incident or an accident. So you have to take everything with you, all of your first aid equipment, and be thinking about your safety and the safety of the team all of the time. So from the point of view of being the chief correspondent leading that kind of coverage, I'm working very much with someone like Dave, the security consultant, so that between us we can work out the best way of telling the story. Now, it's in his interest to keep me safe, it's his professional reputation, it's in my interest to get the best story, to get the best shots, and we will work on that together. And there's normally a happy medium, and you can't always plan for everything. You know, things happen, but you know if you're in a hot zone, if you're in a particularly hostile part of a challenging environment, you know very much now about the risk of drones and other issues that we're having to deal with, and we're budgeting for that all of the time. And so more recently in Ukraine, drones have been the big issue. We've had to travel in cars with anti-drone measures, spend less time in certain parts of the front line, keep moving around so that we can't be targeted. So we're thinking all of the time. We're just thinking about, but we don't really want to be the story. We want to film the story, and wanting to make sure that the team stays safe. And whilst there was quite a decent life insurance policy through work, I wasn't wanting to cash it in, and they certainly didn't want to pay out. So we were just constantly having this negotiation. And there have been times when they've said no, and that's frustrating, and it's been difficult. And it's something I've had to soak up, but most of the time with careful thought, planning, negotiation, we could find ourselves getting to the right spots, and also through experience and showing that that we have learned. And it's the experience that we bring, I think, that is crucial. And that is why so many of the people you see doing these frontline reports are gnarly old so-and-sos like me, kind of in their 50s now, because someone like Jeremy Bowen, for instance, he's been there, he's seen that, he's done it. He knows. You get a second sense of how these things are going to develop. You kind of feel your way through it. And so, actually, it's a time when not being the pretty young thing is actually quite important. Actually, having that experience is crucial.
Again, a couple of follow-ups to what you said, Richard. I mean, the first thing is, I'm again drawing parallels. When you're in a sensitive, challenging situation, you want trusted advisors around you. And again, I think that's a message for those of us working in business, knowing that you have people you can rely upon, that you can trust, that have the right expertise when you are facing those most challenging situations is so important. You don't want amateurs supporting you when you're in the front line, and same applies in business. And my second, this is more of a question than an observation. I assume that you stay relatively calm in some of these heated crisis situations in which you're involved. How do you do that, again, for people who are not in crisis or crisis situations the whole time, even very experienced business leaders making decisions under that level of pressure and staying cool and calm is challenging. So how do you do that?
Okay, so I mean, there is a point of difference, is that I'm willingly there, going to be part of that crisis, rather than sadly having to experience it and deal with the aftermath. Although on occasion, we have found ourselves in the midst of a crisis and having to deal with the outcomes of that. In terms of staying calm, I think, firstly, it's having that focus. My focus is on the storytelling. It's about getting to the place we need to be, finding the people we need to speak to, filming what we need to film, getting out as safely as we possibly can, getting back to that point of safety, and then delivering the story, or delivering that story from where we are. That calmness comes in the fact that you have to work as part of a team. Whilst I have found myself in hostile environments, filming for myself, broadcasting by myself, mostly in these situations, I'm working as part of a team and I'm relying on those people. And if you're all winding each other up, if you're all getting overly excited, overly hyped, pushing too hard, driving people in a direction that they're not comfortable with, then the results are not going to be good. And so, you know, that joint focus, sitting down, and I'm a big believer in meetings before we go out and meetings when we come back. You know, that kind of that planning, what are we going to, and it normally happens around breakfast, because that's just how it is, that you sit down and you say, what are we going to see today? What are we hoping to see? You know, what's likely to happen? Talk it through. Think about the different scenarios, go through the risk assessment, look at the map, look at the plan, get there, do it, continue that conversation calmly all the way through. And then at the end of the day, come back with your material. And, you know, I love food. I like to have, you know, a glass of wine with a meal. And what I like to do is to sit down with the team and talk it through. If you're living in a constant sense of hype, you're not going to be able to calmly kind of get together and with people. And if people are overly excited all of the time, you're not going to be making the right decisions. So taking that time to think, to plan, and then that wash up period at the end, because, you know, it will be a chance to say what's gone well, but also what didn't go so well. Why didn't we get what we expected to get? And, you know, what could we do better? And perhaps tomorrow, what could we go off and do in a different way is really, really important. And that teamwork is so important. And that's why I've loved being a television journalist so much, because it is a team. I mean, you see here on the screen 4 people. In most normal non-conflict situations, I'm working with 1 or 2 other people. But, you know, I'm wanting to make sure that I'm taking them with me. The last thing you want is to have a colleague who does not feel, has not bought in to what you're trying to do. And at that point, that's when things start to fall to bits. And I have had that situation where, for whatever reason, I've had a colleague who's just suddenly, you know, it's often due to the fact that they've been confronted by a situation that they're not comfortable with. That has fired something else in them. And then you're trying to manage them, and you're trying to manage the story and your output, and that becomes that much harder.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, the parallels. So what I'm translating into the crisis management professionals world is you have to build that cohesion within your team. You know, in a worst case scenario, some of the company teams in a crisis are being thrown together without having operated in crisis together before. That's why rehearsal is so important. What I also heard you saying earlier on in kind of that answer was the importance of kind of knowing why you are there and what you're seeking to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. If I translate that, that's about knowing what your strategic intent is in managing the crisis, knowing what the priorities are and working out how you're going to do it. So a really good plan. And then I love the point about the wash up in the evening. That is another critical thing, both within a crisis and after the crisis. Exactly what you said, Richard. What went well, what didn't go so well, how are we going to do it differently or better in future? So talking about more corporate crises, I guess the first one isn't a corporate crisis as such, but it was one that was certainly in the eyes of the world for a number of weeks, the Chilean mine rescue, which you mentioned earlier on, Richard. You were there. And then slightly more corporate crisis, Costa Concordia. Talk to us a little bit about organizations and businesses that you've seen in crisis, and what's worked well, what's not worked so well, and what works best for you as a reporter on situations like this.
Yeah, I mean, the Chile one was really interesting because it did have some sort of organic growth. It had been going on for some weeks, that these men had been trapped so far underground, and, you know, they had no obvious way of getting them out. And there wasn't a corporate element to it, but I think the mining company was so small that, you know, there wasn't a huge amount of interest in pinning their fate on that mining company. But it became clear, I think, that you know, there was a failure of governance in as much as issuing these licenses, the safety checks not being made, and so many of these small mines springing up around, you know, this really quite desolate part of the world, the Atacama Desert. I don't think I've ever been anywhere quite like it. You know, you arrive in 40-degree heat, and by the time you're in the middle of the night, it's freezing, and you're in the middle of nowhere, having driven there to stay in a tent and cook on a little camping stove. It's quite something. But what the Chilean government did really well there was suddenly to take control of how that story was going to be told, and they started bringing things in to make it more comfortable for the journalists. You know, there was some catering facilities brought in, and not just for the journalists, but also for the relatives of the miners who also come to live around the mine itself. They put toilet facilities in place, and it was really important that that was happening, because it was going to become another disaster of its own. You know, when you suddenly get a lot of people in the middle of nowhere with no facilities, again, it's something to think about. You know, if you have that kind of story on the horizon, how can we, you know, make things better? But then the messaging, giving those regular updates, giving picture feeds, you know, setting up exclusion zones around the mine workings, but allowing, you know, cameras to come in at certain times, putting vantage points in place, just managing the whole thing. And so from the first moment I arrived, where there was an element of chaos, to the moment when the men came out of the ground, everything had then really been choreographed. And it meant that when you did get that good news, and eventually it came, and it was looking pretty bad for quite a while, there were the great camera shots being offered on a pooled basis. They were working with the news agencies. You know, all of the things that you need to do in a big crisis, thinking about how that coverage is going to be coordinated so it looks as smooth as possible. And I think, you know, flip side, on the other side, you see, you know, the Costa Concordia there. I was there very quickly after it struck the rocks. And I feel that at that point, I mean, Costa was a comparatively small cruise company, but part of the wider Carnival group. And at the time, I think it, you know, it was being sold as this is a story that's just affecting a small Italian cruise company, but quite quickly became part of a much bigger corporate crisis. And they weren't as quick to get people on the ground to start organizing things. And very quickly, the Italian authorities took the captain away. All of these background stories started coming out about him, his personal life, the pictures of him with the various women in his life, and all of this showboating that he'd done in the past. He then ended up in court quite quickly, so they lost a bit of control of that process, of course, as well. And meanwhile, there were still people missing on the cruise ship, and you know, I was standing quite close to it. I had this most incredible experience, actually, where I was wearing a red coat at the time, and I think I got mistaken for an Italian rescue worker because they all wore red coats. And I was ushered onto a boat, taken out right to it. We were right under the bow, and I was put on the shore as close as possible to it and stood there right next to it doing pieces to camera. And, you know, knowing that they were still searching for people inside. And it's this idea that you might think that the cruise ship running aground was the worst thing could happen. It could only get better from then on. It didn't. It got worse as those personal stories came out, not just of this kind of playboy captain, but of those members of crew in particular who were living and working on board, and perhaps have been helping people to the very last, and were now still missing inside. And you know, that was a story that just ran and ran, and continued to do so, really, in a way, for months and years afterwards, as it lay there as a testament to this foolishness. You know, and this slack safety culture that are built up within this particular cruise firm.
So a couple of observations there. One, you know, the importance, you can't control the narrative, but you can influence it. And, you know, in the Atacama Desert, I say quite unconventionally, and something will be, I think, quite frightening to a lot of organisations, the media was invited in and provided with everything they kind of needed to cover the story. That sounds in some ways counterintuitive, but actually it increases your degree of influence and control, and I guess also means I don't mean you're regarded positively by the media in terms of you're necessarily a wonderful organisation, but at least you feel the organisation is working with you rather than seeking to hide or manipulate. And I think the second thing in both of these examples is that ultimately, we've talked about it a lot on this webinar, every crisis is ultimately about people. That is at the heart of it. And I think that's a message that logically we all understand, but there is still that temptation if you are the CFO or the CEO that your focus is distracted by the share price or the commercial impact. You must be driven by and focused on the people, because that's what it's really about.
Yeah, most certainly. When you look about, you know, big companies, you know, chemical firms, energy companies, all, you know, you're right. The bottom line, of course, is really important, but it's people like me turning up on the ground, finding the people who've been badly affected, you know, who've had their livelihoods ruined, their homes destroyed, their children have been poisoned, whatever it is. And those are the stories that just keep going on and on. And the longer we're there, the harder we dig, the more we find. And that's why I say that crisis, you know, often after that initial shock, that first explosion, that first leak, whatever it is, it can get worse as those images start to come out and start to make it to our screens and to our front pages.
Okay, so Richard and I are going to chat for another 10 minutes or so before taking questions. I know we have some already, but please do post your questions, which we will cover in the final 10 minutes of the discussion. So, okay, moving on. The evolving media landscape. Now, again, when I started in crisis management, there was no social media. I remember sending my very first email, let alone social media. That obviously had a massive impact on the communication challenges and opportunities in a crisis. We've now got a real rise in mis and disinformation and this thing that is called fake news. What's your kind of perspective on the evolving media landscape, you know, big changes you've seen, particularly recent big changes, and the future of the media landscape and what that means for those who need to communicate and manage in crisis, Richard?
Okay, let's get the positive stuff out of the way first. And that technology you talk about that has changed so much in the 30 years that I've been doing this, and specifically this thing, my mobile phone, and that mobile phone technology, mobile internet, has absolutely changed the face of reporting a crisis, because you know, I can now turn up, as I did a summer or two ago when that awful yacht tragedy happened in Sicily, where our who's the billionaire whose name sadly I've just forgotten, but I'll be reminded of, the yacht turned over, and you know, they had that awful situation. I had to run to Sicily with no bags and effectively did everything from my mobile phone by myself, and actually back in London, nobody could tell the difference. So the way that the technology's got cheaper, the way that we're now surrounded by the internet, means that using a mobile phone, using a small camera with a box that's got multiple SIM cards in it, we can broadcast from pretty much anywhere in the planet. And if they don't have a mobile data signal, we can plug a small satellite dish in, a Starlink dish from Elon Musk or someone else, and do the same thing. So nowhere really is immune from coverage anymore. It's made it easier for us to get there more quickly. We can get there more cheaply. Budgets are a big problem, and that's the negative, really, that the tech industries have absolutely taken over the world. We know that. All of that money, the billions of dollars, are now flooding to people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and as such, it's starving television, in particular newspapers, of advertising revenue. So when I first started, television was king in terms of the adverts. Everybody wanted to advertise on television, you know, and when social media first started, it was 5, 10, 20% of the market. Didn't really have much of an impact on television advertising revenue. That has changed completely now. And one of the reasons I'm sat here at home today and not broadcasting on the television is that there is a massive crisis happening in television in terms of how do you fund news. And those tech industries have effectively changed the advertising model completely. Niche advertising on social media channels has really taken the lion's share now of advertising money, and that means that television companies have less money coming through, less money to spend on news, and that also governs story choices. And so, big decisions are now being made as to what stories you go on. So it's a weird situation. You have this, on one hand, it's got cheaper to cover the news, to get out there, to put stuff on. You don't have to carry 15 big cases of equipment and lots of lights and a big satellite dish and all of that stuff. But on the other hand, the revenue is falling, and they're yet really to work out a way of how to monetize news. So that is having an impact at the same time that everyone has become a citizen journalist. Again, this thing, amazing, because you can get out there and film stuff that's happening. I'm in the process of having something of a flood happening outside my house at the moment because of all the rain. There's a lorry that's pumping away the water from the drains. I could go and film that. I could put that online. I can share it with my local news organizations. And in large part, if I do it well, they might use it. That's great. So that has democratized news from the point of view. It's given us more eyeballs on the ground around the place. But it also, the misinformation you've talked about, not just footage that purports to be from somewhere else that's not, or stories that just aren't true, but things that are completely made up, with AI, artificial intelligence. Now I could put some prompts in and create an image of a bomb site or a rocket attack in Ukraine that just hadn't happened, or in Russia for the same thing. So as a journalist, you'll happen to be that much more careful. And as a business organization, you have to be that much more careful, because yes, you're open to seeing yourself being put around the world, but knowing what's true, what's right, you need to be looking so much more carefully. And so all of these things are having a big impact on news. And so the things that you might see flashing up on your screens, on your social media feeds, as big breaking news stories from organizations you don't know and trust, it might just take some time for the what I would call the legacy organizations to check that stuff out, to make sure it's true. And in the same way that they're doing that, you need to be doing that as well.
Thank you, Richard. We do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to move on to our final slide before posing those to you. So I guess, what are some of the key tips that you would give to in-house crisis leaders if they are to succeed in the environment that you've just described?
So it is, and you've mentioned it, it's looking at your risk profile and working out what the worst is that can happen. So that's what we're doing when we're going into a crisis, into a challenging environment, facing a potential crisis. What is the worst thing that could happen? Mitigating for that, working the best we can. You can't avoid the risk altogether, but it's knowing that if it happened, what we were going to do. So, that Costa Concordia is a great example of it. An awful lot of things can go wrong for a cruise ship and a cruise organization, but running on the rocks, turtle, people dying, drowning, that is the worst possible scenario. That is the kind of situation that they would need to have been planning for, and any business should be doing that. And then keeping in your mind what I've been saying all the way through is that what I always say, that it only gets worse once you've had that initial phone call. So having that support that you need around you, having the team that you believe in, that you trust in, that you can call, having all of the numbers in your phone for people that you can call, because these things always happen in the middle of the night, and they always happen at the worst possible time for you and at that weekend. So keeping across where your team are. So, for me, I have been living pretty much in a state of chaos for the last 26 years because I've never known when that phone was going to call. The only positive thing I can say right now about not doing the job that I've been doing right now, as I have this little enforced break, is that I'm not waiting for that phone to call because I could be jumping on a plane. But when I did, I knew I had a team of people all around that could help and that I could rely on. So it's having that kind of team of people, talking things through, and then once you're into that crisis, knowing that you can take a deep breath together and stare it in the face and work calmly and professionally through it. And don't get so wound up about what you're seeing on the social media feeds, but working with media to try to, you know, get your message out where you can and be honest where you can. Because if you're not being honest, you're going to find yourself in a very difficult place, maybe not in the first few days or few hours, but certainly down the line. And we're seeing that play out right now with our government. You know, what we need really for Keir Starmer to say is, I put Peter Mandelson in place because of his links with Jeffrey Epstein, because he knew Donald Trump through Jeffrey Epstein, and, you know, and they had something in common. We were going to get a better deal, and that was my gamble, and the gamble's gone wrong. That's kind of the situation that the Prime Minister's in at the moment. He can't say it. He can't be that honest. But honesty to the degree that you can feel that you can share with people, really important all the way through a crisis.
It may also be, Richard, that the Prime Minister didn't do his risk assessment quite as effectively as you do your risk assessment. But
Yeah,
we have quite a number of questions. So, as I say, let's move on to those questions from our audience. So the first one is from Angie. Firstly, I'm sorry that you are no longer the chief correspondent for Good Morning Britain and ITV. You are greatly missed. What support were you given once you leave the front line and return home to process what you've experienced? How do you switch off having covered a major situation?
Angie, that's really kind, and thank you very much for that. That means a lot. I think it's something you learn with experience, how to put these awful things that you see into a box of sorts and move back to your normal life. And you're almost doing that in the field, because by having those meetings in the mornings and in the evenings and discussing what you've seen, it's almost like it's a process of being able to help get some of that distress out of the system. There is trauma, for sure, in that situation that I faced in Beirut. I came back, I thought I was a superhero because I cheated death. And actually, after a few weeks, my brain was fried by all of these fight or flight valves that had opened up in it and hadn't closed, and I needed some professional help. And actually, again, after that, they became much better at offering that professional help, someone to talk to if you needed to after seeing something. In fact, I hadn't necessarily needed that help since, other than from Ukraine, and it wasn't what I'd seen in Ukraine, which was shocking, that had disturbed me most. I managed to process that myself. It was not being there, that feeling of guilt I needed some help with, because I wanted to be telling the story. And, you know, the news cycle moves on, the budget decreases, the ability to be there all of the time disappeared. And I needed a bit of help with that. So there is help in place. For me, I'm very lucky. I live in a beautiful part of the world. I live down on the South Downs in Hampshire. And I will go out and sit on the hill that looks over our village, and I will take a deep breath. And I had been just in a place called Palu in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, a few years ago for the most awful earthquake and tsunami. I came back, and I'd been surrounded by death, awful amount of death. And I came back, and the next day it was the village vendage. They were picking the grapes in the vineyard for the wine, and I did that. And actually, I sat up on the hill, and I had a good cry, because I thought, wow, my life is just so different, absolutely so different. I can pick and choose getting in and out of these crises, and these poor people I've left behind will be picking up the pieces for decades of their lives. And so that sometimes is quite hard. But again, experience of it, understanding where your place in this whole process, how important and useful it is that you can be there telling these stories, how actually you can help that aid effort, the relief that goes in, really important too.
And again, people on this call will have been under pressure, not as frequently as you, but when they have been involved in crises. And I think knowing how to release that pressure valve, your hill that you sit on, or whatever it might be, I think all of us need to know what are those release valves that we can use to start to reduce the stress and pressure we've been under, and to get back in touch with the rest of our lives, because it is challenging when you've been in an intense situation for days or weeks. A question coming in from Mexico. It's J.A. Rincon. I'm going to guess that's Juan Andres. It might not be, so apologies if it's not. But in situations like the Concordia case, what were the points of contact with the corporation? And I guess maybe if I can add to that, who would you like the points of contact to be, or how can you work most effectively with an organisation?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking back. I mean, that's 14, 15 years ago now. At that time, we weren't so well connected with social media at a point where you could effectively, you know, as an organization, create a media channel, if you want, WhatsApp channels for giving people messages. And that's what I like to see now. And you do see an awful lot now of organizations saying, you know, here's our press office number, but what we're going to do, if you're happy, is to put you on this WhatsApp group so everybody gets the same information at the same time. You know, everyone has different you know, things that they want. They're pulling in different directions. Newspaper journalists have a different way of working to television journalists. Deadlines are different. You know, you have a lot of people now who are just broadcasting online as well, you know, perhaps live streaming 24/7. So making sure there is a fair and equal distribution of that information is key. And I'm just trying to think whether there was or not. At that point, I would have been more reliant upon the news feeds coming from, you know, Reuters, the press agency, Associated Press, Associated France Press as well, and making sure that, you know, Agence France Presse, sorry, so that that flow of information. And historically, I think I would have always said to a company in crisis, make sure they were your first point of contact. That might still be the case if you're wanting to get good distribution on the news wires, and the news wires are still really important to legacy broadcasters like us. But if you know that you've got people on the ground, get someone out there as quickly as possible. Start distributing that you know, WhatsApp group. It used to be we'd set up, you know, we'd be put onto an email chain. I think WhatsApp is a much more responsive way of dealing with it, and I saw that immediately the moment I got onto the ground in Israel after the October the 7th attacks. I mean, for all of their faults, the Israeli government's press office was very quick in setting up a WhatsApp group for all of the foreign journalists that had arrived in the country to cover that specific event. I still get updates from them on a regular basis that I can see, I can opt in and opt out of, I can mute them, but it's useful to know that I'm sharing that. And so when there was a site visit perhaps to a kibbutz or to another area where they wanted to illustrate or show us something that had happened in the days that followed the attack, it meant that we were all aware of what was happening and there wasn't special treatment given. And that's the other thing. You know, you may have a relationship with certain journalists. That's great. It can be useful, but don't ignore those ones who are turning up fresh. Don't think everybody knows the situation with your particular organization. If you treat everyone the same, it will be so much better for the overall coverage.
Couple of questions left in the final 5 or 6 minutes. This one leads on to, you mentioned Israel, from Stuart. Given your experience reporting from conflict zones, how do news organisations handle situations like Gaza, where international journalists have very limited or no access, while at the same time there are reports of unusually high risks to local reporters? How does that affect what audiences end up seeing, and how prominently journalist safety is covered? So,
I mean, Gaza is a really complex example of that particular situation, because you've got different types of broadcasters working in the same zone. So you have the Middle Eastern-based broadcasters who are, firstly, have got a setup in these places largely, although Al Jazeera found themselves in a very difficult position, being forced out of Israel by the Israeli government, but also have teams of stringers and freelancers that they've worked with and had working for them for a number of years. So they're set up. For people like me going in, much harder. So I spent most of my time sat on the border, very sadly, watching that destruction of Gaza, those mushroom clouds going up as, you know, more ordnance was fired in and more missiles hit, and relying on those agencies we talked about who gather that kind of material, again, from a network of stringers and freelancers. Now, you know, at that point, we're putting our faith into those agencies, that their reputation is such that they are relying on decent, hard-working journalists, and they almost always are. I mean, 99.99% of the time, that you can rely on that kind of information. And what you're able to do, as the BBC do very well, is to cross-reference that stuff that you're seeing, because you're seeing it on the Middle Eastern and Arab channels, as well as seeing it from the worldwide agencies, Reuters and the Associated Press in particular, who will have invested quite heavily in that. But there is a risk. And we've seen that risk. You know, we've seen these live camera positions in Gaza being targeted, the Israelis claiming that they were, you know, actually points for spying on Israeli troops and targeting their positions. You know, quite clearly wasn't the case, you know, in those particular circumstances. So there is a risk involved. And we are forever thankful that people are willing to take those risks on our behalves in those situations, because it is a very difficult thing for someone like me to be stood on that border, effectively only seeing in from the outside and getting access only to what's happening in southern Israel at that particular point in time. That story shifted quite considerably from the first moment we were there, where it really was about the attack that had happened on southern Israel. But then in the weeks and months that followed, of course, it went the other way, and we were able to try and, you know, tell that story as best we could of what was happening inside of Gaza. Very difficult, but absolutely reliant on those poor journalists, of so many of whom have lost their lives in telling those stories.
Thank you, Richard. Literally two comments and one hopefully short answer to the final question remaining on the list. So first of all, from Christina, not a question, just so thanks so much for sharing. Sue, great presentation with an accomplished news reporter. And then Michelle, this is absolutely fascinating and great, much needed reminder of what journalists like you have to go through to ensure we are kept up to date with what is going on in the world. And Michelle's follow-up question on that is, you mentioned the Chilean government handled miners' crisis well. Who or where else have you experienced a crisis handled well, either an organisation or an individual that you think has done a particularly good job?
Oh gosh, now you've really put me on the spot. I should have been thinking about this more. Can I come back to you, Michelle? I'm going to have a think about it. I'm going to get your email address from Jonathan and have a think. I'm not going to just splurge out. I have 1 minute left and I can hear that clock ticking. This is the point in my ear where they normally say, wrap it up because we've got the adverts coming at the top of the hour and it's the adverts that pay your wages. I mean, there are very good examples, I know, of organisations that work hard. I'm going to think of one that I've been particularly involved in and I will write to you, Michelle, I promise you. And thank you for your kind comments about the presentation. It's been a pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you too. Thanks for everyone who's joined us. I think that's been hugely enlightening in so many different ways. I sincerely appreciate you agreeing to do this discussion, Richard. Clearly the feedback's been incredibly positive. I think people have appreciated your honesty, openness, insight and wisdom. So thank you. If you'd like to get in touch with Richard or I, our contact details are there. For Michelle, I will throw a name into the pot. It's one we were actually talking about in our pre-webinar chat. Marks and Spencer faced some real challenges with their cyber incident earlier this year, some real challenges. But I think the way they communicated in response to that was excellent, led by the CEO, Stuart Machin. So that would be my suggestion for an organisation that has responded and certainly communicated well in the light of a crisis. So thank you everyone for joining us again. Thank you specifically to Richard, and we will see you all next month for our next webinar. I hope you all have a crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks.